Hey, it's Monday, December 1st. Happy Thanksgiving. I hope you got something good. I hope you got something good that wasn't just turkey. I'm not a big turkey guy. I'm a big seafood guy. And so that's what I'm focused on these days. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed yourself. We're going to be looking this week at the big headlines from last week. That includes the big action from Trump on trying to push this executive order that would wipe out state AI laws, not to mention a big antitrust loss for the Federal Trade Commission against Meta. There's also a really interesting thing around Taiwan that I've been learning about that sort of changes the geopolitics of our dependence on that country. That's very interesting. And then we're going to look at the conference season that's coming up. Huge, big sort of world direction determining conferences are starting this week in the AI world, and they're going to determine a lot about how those models affect your life going forward. We're going to look at all that and more on the Rip Current today. So it was a big week last week. I was on tenterhooks for the most part around the executive order that Trump was presumably going to sign. That we saw a leaked draft. If you followed me last week, you got to see a bit of it. That leaked draft, showed us that this guy really was determined to wipe out the state's ability to regulate AI, which is funny because nobody else is doing it. We are in a world right now where there is no federal regulation around AI. We don't even have federal data privacy laws. We're like 20 plus years into the social media game, and yet we don't have a thing that protects our data online. So, and yet President Trump, and so we've had all 50 states plus Puerto Rico have passed something connected to AI. I was looking at the various laws out there, and one of them, even Montana, population 1.1 million, has a big, fancy, very sophisticated law about not allowing people to make AI versions of other people without their permission and limiting the ways in which government is allowed to use this stuff. Very sophisticated for a state the size of a city in California. So it's just amazing that Trump would be willing to try and take this on. But it seems that he doesn't really want to do it directly. And so that executive order has kind of gone by the wayside. It may be because it polls terribly. I mean, something like, it's the vast majority, something like, I can't remember the number exactly, but it's like 79% or something like that of, I believe it was 79% of Republicans and 80-something% of Democrats were fully on board with the idea that AI should be regulated, and they didn't care if it slowed the industry down. So with polling that bad, perhaps Trump just decided this wasn't his move, and instead he's making Congress do it. So Congress is supposedly going to try and shoehorn this into the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a kind of must-pass budget type thing. So we'll be watching for that. We also last week saw the Federal Trade Commission lose big against Meta in their efforts to prove that Meta is a social media monopoly. A judge disagreed with them, and that it all went to hell for the Federal Trade Commission. And that's really the end of the Biden era administrative actions against big tech. And it, as a result, signals, I think, the start of the era. The fact that and this executive order were happening at the same time really signals the start of an era, the Trump era, when it comes to big tech, which is really just sort of letting them go, letting them do what they like. And it was interesting. I had a commenter from last week when I brought up Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, going abroad and trying to use the threat of tariffs to browbeat EU regulators into dropping their laws against their regulations of American tech companies. I had one commenter basically say, "Well, why would you be surprised by that? Of course, the American government should be supporting its own companies." And I was like, "Wow, that's a really interesting question," because I think of the history of Democratic versus Republican politics as being the history of people who believe one way or the other, right? The history of Democratic politics in this country, at least in the 20th century, had everything to do with trying to empower labor against corporate interests, right? Trying to win the unions by giving them as much of a bargaining position with management as possible, right? So it's interesting. Like, I think of the American government in that vein as being something, as regulating companies, not being their cheerleaders around the world. And it's really only the sort of the Clinton, Obama era kind of pro-business Democrat. That's a pretty new thing. It's really a departure from the history of the Democratic Party. And so that was a sort of little interesting aside. So It really is the end, I think, of that era. The end of this FTC shoot down, and this much bigger embrace of big tech moving forward. Also, one more headline that I was really interested in that came out this morning, December 1st, was an interview. It's a weird one because it's an interview from October, but NPR is releasing it today for some reason, in which one of their tech correspondents gets an interview with Wendell Huang, who's the CEO of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. TSMC, if you don't know, is the world's number one supplier of chips to the United States. We buy a huge amount of our chips from them. And this is for everything from the really fancy chips that make AI possible, all the way down in our fancy phones and all that stuff, all the way down to like the chips that make your air conditioner go, right? That we really like. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do all kinds of fancy stuff in our lives, and that would bring not just AI to a halt. It would bring the manufacture of cars to a halt. And so it is hugely important to the geopolitical stability of the United States that we keep Taiwan safe. And one of the big problems, of course, is that Taiwan is claimed by China. Taiwan is, according to has a representative of the United Nations, right? Is an independent nation by its own consideration. But the Chinese do not feel that way. They feel that it is part of China and that they're going to take it back eventually. They talk about that in their rhetoric all the time. And as you can imagine, China was watching pretty closely when the Ukraine was invaded by Russia on the same kind of pretext. This is a former part of our nation, and we're just taking it back. Don't mind us. And the United States didn't really mind, right? It certainly doesn't anymore. And so you can imagine China watching pretty closely to see how we would have reacted, and I'm sure took some comfort from the idea that we didn't really mind the invasion that Russia perpetrated against Ukraine. So it's got people in my world pretty nervous that China might not wander into, but invade Taiwan, and as a result disrupt the global supply of chips, especially the global supply of chips to the United States. So Wendell Huang, the CEO of TSMC, gave this interview in which he basically said, we're going to start looking abroad, beyond Taiwan, for our operations. Like right now, TSMC is like one of the dominant economic forces in that country. I mean, it literally is one of the main reasons the United States is such an ally to Taiwan. And if you're advanced materials or what is it? I can't think of it, but Qualcomm, the big companies that buy chips from TSMC, they have like a whole little city built around the company's office park so that they can have offices right next to them. It's such an important relationship. But now you've got Wendell Huang talking about going abroad as much as possible. Trying to expand to other places. Already we know that they've, as of 2020, they had committed to building a bunch of fabs in Arizona. So building some stuff here is a really interesting thing. But they have more than 500 customers around the world, and so they're looking to sort of diversify their placement. Huang said to NPR, "This is a small island. Resources are limited, so we need to expand overseas." They made it sound like a sort of a business strategy, profit, get closer to our customers kind of move, but it also is a huge deal for the geopolitical reliance, the world reliance on Taiwan for what TSMC provides. And if it begins providing it from somewhere else in the world, that'll be pretty interesting. So the big thing, though, I want to talk about is the conferences coming up this week. So there is a big AWS conference, the reInvent conference, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the big, Amazon Web Services conference. Amazon's a company right now where people I know who work inside that company say that if you can't prove that you're using AI enough, you get fired. And that company is under huge pressure at this conference to basically prove that you can make money on AI, because they need to show that spending all of this money on compute is going to pay off. And so I think you're going to see a whole pony show around like, look, you can make this kind of product and these kinds of services. All of that's going to be going off during their conference. But the big conference that I am watching is called NeurIPS. NeurIPS is it's a weird one. It's sort of academic, but it's also really it's an industry conference, really. So it's a really interesting place. This is somebody who visualized some of the papers that are being presented this year. And Europe's is interesting because you're as likely to get, because basically there are all these academic researchers in AI, but then there are all these academic researchers who have been basically vacuumed up by the big companies. You're as likely to see people at this conference from Stanford as you are to see people from ByteDance, giving presentations. And the last few years, you've seen like some big headlines come out of it, at least in my world, right? You've seen the realization that like generative adversarial networks, GANs, were no longer the way to try and make good AI imagery. Instead, diffusion was going to be the move. You saw last year Ilya Sutskever, the co-founder of OpenAI, basically saying that the era of normal pre-training is over because we got to figure out new ways to train our models. When people speak out there, they then tend to speak out more and more. And, in the end, Ilya Sutskever is now most recently saying, that basically LLMs and the current sort of AI moment is not going to lead us to superintelligence. So I'm going to be watching for some of the themes. And this person very helpfully on GitHub has been putting out some of those themes and kind of making them clear. This is the papers, the 6,000 or so papers that have been submitted. And all that, in this cloud is grouping them into categories. And so things like vision in 3D, the 3D reconstruction for robotics, right? This is how Teslas try to navigate on their own. This is how it is that we're seeing this new Neo bot that just debuted recently that's supposed to be sort of a household helper bot. This is one of the most near-term and probably one of the most profitable applications of this stuff. You're seeing things like efficient LLM training and inference. The inference is just a fancy word for giving the answer when you ask a question. But right now, it costs so much money to run these data centers that make your, put your cat in a bikini kind of images, those sorts of things, right? It require huge amounts of compute. And that's why you've got these companies building data centers all over the world. Armenia just announced they're going to get some huge, like $100 billion one, full of the fanciest GPUs, right? These countries are all going to be home to these huge data centers because of all this stuff. And so if you can make that training and that inference more efficient, it could be a big, big money saver. So that's obviously a big focus here. There's all kinds of stuff around like evaluations and LLM evaluation and capabilities. Can they do reasoning? Can they be responsible with your credit card? All that kind of stuff. Reinforcement learning, how do you teach it highly specialized stuff? And then the one that I really am most interested by is preference alignment, which, it can be as simple as, do you tend to, does the LLM or this AI system tend to, can you teach it to stray more in this direction or more in this direction? And that can be things like, push toward this kind of tool set versus this kind of tool set. But it can also be, of course, things like, alignment is a term that we use, that AI people use, that's very similar to how it's used in Dungeons and Dragons. Like, are you aligned with the values of the user? And the funny thing about this is, if you've paid any attention to what I talk about, you know that I talk a lot about how naive an idea it is that we could agree on alignment for a system like this, that we could somehow pre-build values into one of these systems when you can't even get two human beings, much less even two political scientists, to agree on what our universal human values should theoretically be. But, the thing to watch for in this circumstance, at this gathering, is just this amazing amount of sort of intellectual activity you're going to see, in which people really, you're going to see a big name, run their mouth about something they're frustrated about, something they think is not working, and it's going to set the tone for the year's worth of, really high level, really expensive work that goes on when it comes to AI. So this stuff is really, it's a big tone setter. this conference, and that's why I'm going to be paying close attention to it. I'm also on Thursday going to be doing a guest hosting spot of This Week in Tech, which is a big podcast you may check out, you may know. I'm doing an interview with a couple of different journalists about why it is people are taking AI on as a romantic companion, and a big profile of Scott Wiener, the California state senator who wrote the AI bill here that's basically the most sort of as close to a national law around AI as we've got. So tune into that if you'd like to, and I really appreciate you spending time with me. Thanks.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.